Thank you, Noel, and thank you, Joe, particularly for the invitation today, because it's a real honour. I've only ever sat where you're sitting, so it's very special to be here today. Owen said that he is only speaking from his notes and that he doesn't normally do scripts. Well, given when I go off topic how much trouble I get into, I'm very much going to keep to my script today. The LMFM DJ rang me that night going on holidays on the Friday evening and told me try not to cause an election before he comes back, so I'm very much going to keep in that train. Teresa's presentation to us this morning is really interesting, because what I've learned about myself is that I'm a centrist, conservative, liberal, working class dub that has supported Fine Gael through generations of my family since about 1920, 25, and that's really confusing. And probably equally as confusing as what I was asked to talk about today is the aftermath of the 2016 election and the future of politics in Ireland, and particularly how we change and do our work within our parliament structure. So I think without doubt it's probably fair to say that not just in Ireland but right across the world, given the Irish property collapse, the global economic crisis, I know that some people probably tried to blame our own crisis on, the unrest in the Middle East recently, the rise of China and Russia, the real unrest in Turkey over the last number of days, the very serious rise of the force that is ISIS, and I think the slow decline in the United States, they're all having a real impact on how people see our future, and I think are genuinely impacting and making us reflect on how we vote. The vote of the people in the United Kingdom in the last number of weeks, of course, I think is probably the most recent and probably the most obvious sign of this change in the way we vote. But here in Ireland, I think we've seen a significant shift in our politics as well. The general elections of 2011 and 2016 were important, and they might just be signalling a realignment in Irish politics, but only time will tell. And I agree with Owen in a lot of ways that I don't think that that's a bad thing. And I certainly don't think it's a crisis like some of my probably more conservative colleagues see it. I think it's an opportunity for real people who probably have felt disenfranchised in the past and didn't see a calling to some of the more established parties to have a voice in this country. And I think what's really important is the opportunity that we have now, as what's probably always classified as the establishment parties, is to listen to that and to learn from it. And I think that's very important. I think we are in a period of uncertainty, and I think what's probably considered the political wisdom of today can certainly be questioned and challenged as the foolish speculation by some people tomorrow. The 2011 general election was held at a real time of economic uncertainty. I don't think we've ever seen anything like it in how we feel and how we reacted ever before. Voters in this country overwhelmingly elected Fine Gael and Labour with a significant majority, I think because there was a real need and a want and a desire for stability, but also, I suppose, due to a concern about a single majority rule, which is why Labour was such an integral part of that government, something that Irish voters had rejected every government since 1977. The voters also punished Fianna Fáil for what I believe is their mismanagement of the economy, reducing the party to a third place in overall Irish politics behind Labour and Fine Gael. And after 79 years of being the most popular party in the state, the party which had dominated the political landscape, the party which people would have said was in the Irish people's DNA, it was decimated. And I think for many political people, many commentators in 2011, although we expected obviously Fianna Fáil to be hit at the ballot box, I don't think any of us genuinely expected it to come back with the result that it did, and I don't think they did either. So for me, again, the general election of this year was another economic shift and political shift. So Fine Gael, while we're still the biggest party in Dáil Éireann, we were greatly reduced. We lost in excess of 20 seats. Labour, which was the second largest party, was reduced to 7. Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin certainly did make gains, but for me, the rise of the independents probably was the most significant thing that happened in the recent election. And so, when the Dáil met on the 10th of March, it became clear that we had a very fragmented Parliament. The economic crisis that dominated in the 2011 general election had improved significantly by 2016, but not to the extent that people and voters felt secure. And as with other countries around the world, there has been a drift from the political centre to the political fringes, and this was reflected in 2016 and is ably shown by Theresa earlier on. Many of the smaller parties now in the Dáil have always exhibited an unwillingness to go into government and to take responsibility. Sinn Féin, despite their coalition with the DUP in the north, adopted the same unwillingness, I think, during the negotiations after this election. And as did some of the smaller parties, particularly on the left. And maybe not out of fear of taking responsibility, but out of fear of being outflanked by those to their left, because, as Theresa has already said, that spectrum on the left has become very much wider than it ever was heretofore. And after Fianna Fáil refused Fine Gael's offer, probably out of fear of Sinn Féin to their left, to discuss any coalition arrangements, the only option for us at that stage, or for Ireland at that stage, despite another election, was to form a minority government. And as it turns out, despite fighting election in February and setting out the policies they hoped to implement in the government, the majority of the Dáil didn't want to take the responsibility or maybe the electoral consequences that actually being part of that government would be. So we ended up with an alliance of Fine Gael, the Independent Alliance, and some independents that have formed, I suppose, taken the responsibility and the difficult task of forming that minority government. And some of the commentary around the formation of this minority government in May would actually lead you to believe that we've never had minority governments in Ireland before. But the reality is that since 1922 we've had 14 minority governments, and many of them have led the country through some of the most difficult times in our history. Our system of PR and our multi-seat constituencies gives a distinct advantage to smaller parties to enter the Dáil, and twice Fianna Fáil have sought through referendums to replace our voting system with something more likely, a system more likely to give and provide overall majorities, and twice the Irish people have refused this, and I agree with them. I think they're right. So since Fianna Fáil dropped their outright opposition to coalition government in 1989, we have not seen a minority government until now. The last 27 period of years is a political lifetime. The vast majority of TDs currently in Leinster House, the journalists, the commentators, myself included, were not even involved in politics at the time of the Tallaght strategy, as advocated by Alan Dukes. And majority governments, by their very nature, shifted power from the Parliament to the executive. And today, amidst, I suppose, a clamouring appetite for change, that is now changing. So for us in Ireland, a minority government is a new departure in this time frame, but many countries around the world have been successfully governing with minority governments, and it is the norm. And I think we must learn from these countries and the politics of work in these countries, because we're likely to see more of it in Ireland in the future. In Denmark, minority government is the natural form of government, and its current government party only has 34 members out of a 179-seat parliament. In New Zealand, minority governments have been a feature of government since electoral reforms were introduced in 1996. Between 2004 and 2011, first the Liberals and then the Conservatives formed minority governments in Canada. And closer to home, between 2007 and 2011, the Scottish National Party formed a very successful minority government with only 47 seats of the 129-seat Scottish Parliament. And following the elections earlier this year, the SNP are again in a minority government in Scotland. So it is becoming the norm, and not just obviously in Ireland. Political reform is a subject that no matter what the steps are taken to introduce it, there will always be a viewpoint that there's either too little or too late. And I think it's fair to say that when the Fine Gael Labour government was elected in 2011, it was on the basis of their economic programme, their economic policies, rather than their political reform agenda. But it's also fair to say that many of the political reforms introduced between 2011 and 2016 have had a far-reaching effect. So, for example, like the establishment of linking funding to political parties with the running of the number of female candidates in general elections, first of all saw a much larger number of women being run as candidates in the election this year, where heretofore political parties would have told you that we couldn't find any. And more probably particularly poignant is that we have a larger number of women TDs and senators returned to Dáil Éireann. They're not in the same numbers that we'd like, but we're starting, and at least we're going in the right direction. We introduced a secret ballot for the election of the County Cork in the last government, and you can see we have a really democratic process through the way we elected the County Cork this time, and in last week, the week before, the last County Cork. We saw an establishment of a process called pre-legislative scrutiny for all bills, which will enable bills to be published in its heads of form as opposed to a big, long, already decided document, and to invite both citizens and people with interest in a particular topic or the particular piece of legislation to come in and give us advice criticise, give us their views, to be able to make sure that the piece of legislation takes on board all people's views, but is a more robust piece of legislation and therefore will have more far-reaching effects. TDs were given the opportunity to hold the government to account by increasing leaders' questions, by increasing question time to all of our government ministers. And TDs were given a real good opportunity to introduce their own bills through private members' times and to actually have the opportunity to have them passed. Because in the last 5 years, and probably before that, the chances of getting a bill passed through the Dáil Éireann and Seanad Éireann if you were in opposition or a backbench TD was practically zilch. There was a cross-party political reform committee chaired by the Ceann Comhairle, endorsed the Oireachtas reforms by the previous government in the last 5 years by retaining them. But in government between 2011 and 2016, Fine Gael started that process. But on the 10th of March, I think we all realised, and not just us, but every member of the House, to rob another political party's famous phrase, that there was a lot done, but there was an awful lot more to do. So I suppose to the surprise of the people in the House on the 10th of March, we passed a motion to establish a political reform committee, and this was to be chaired by the Ceann Comhairle, and the Oireachtas committees was to seek submissions and suggestions on the issues of Dáil reform, and we were to sit for a period of maybe 8 to 10 weeks and to provide the Oireachtas with a political package of reforms that would see a more independent, more authoritative Parliament. And I'm proud to have served on that committee from day one, along with some members of my own party and members of every single other party in Dáil Éireann. And we sat on a weekly basis. And I genuinely have to say, some of the people around the table I wouldn't have had any relationship with, other than maybe having adversarial comments or commentary with them, either on the Vincent Browne show or on radio or through political debates. But I have to say, every single person that sat around that table took it as seriously and as professionally as everybody else did. And without a shadow of a doubt, we agreed with each other far more during that 9-week period than we ever did have disagreements with each other. And actually, you could see the disagreements might have been in week 1, by week 2. By the time we got to week 3 and week 4, we had all settled into realising that we were all there to do the same thing, which was a body of work that was to actually empower our Parliament and our parliamentarians, and we all wanted that. And by the time we got to week 9 and week 10, sure, we were nearly patting ourselves on the back that we were all friends, which obviously isn't the case in most cases. But I think in the weeks after the government was formed, the Dáil Committee presented our draft to Dáil report to the Dáil for debate. And I think I was in the unique position then of having been appointed the Chief Whip by that stage. So having sat at the committee for the previous 9 weeks, I was now living proof of the changes that we were proposing, most of which probably would have been seen to disempower me in my role or to disempower government. But I actually don't believe that government should ever have control over its national parliament. It should have a healthy respect and interconnection, but not a control. And I think that is the political reforms that we've introduced very much start that ball rolling. Now, they're not perfect, and there's a lot of commentators, both in the Dáil and outside of the Dáil, do see some of the things that need to be tweaked. But reform doesn't have a beginning and it doesn't have an end. And the reform of our Parliament should be an ongoing process. And so what we've agreed in the committee is that we will meet again when the Dáil goes into recess next week and discuss some of the things, and I am gone off topic now, discuss some of the things that are not working and change them. And I think that's what we hope to do. So just very briefly to tell you that the report made a number of reform proposals. We're establishing the Dáil Business Committee, which is now in charge of ordering the business of the House on a weekly basis. Heretofore, the Chief Whip would have come in and told everybody what we were doing. And now we decide what we're doing. And it's a collective responsibility amongst the Business Committee, and we meet on a weekly basis and decide what the business of the House is going to be the following week. Very importantly, we've established a Budget Oversight Committee to allow the Oireachtas a much greater role, and particularly a more meaningful role, in the development of a budget. To assist that committee and the parliamentarians, we've established an independent parliamentary budget office to help every single member of the Oireachtas costs proposals. You've often heard in the media before that something has fully been costed by the Department of Finance or fully costed by, DEPR, when in actual fact a single item might have been fully costed, but not costed in relation to how it will impact on all of the other budgetary spends. This new budgetary office will give people far more of an ability to see how their new policies that they're proposing will impact on everybody else's spending from all other departments. We've expanded the Office of the Parliamentary Legal Advisor to support TDs in our role. Dáil, given that now we have the ability to actually get backbench TDs to have legislation passed, or opposition TDs legislation passed, we want to make sure that the legislation has the best chance of being constitutional, being able to be enforced in law, and this Parliamentary Legal Advice Office is going to do just that job. We've allowed for more technical groups. In the last Dáil, we only had the ability to have one technical group. Now we have four technical groups within the Dáil. We've allowed Oireachtas committees to only sit outside of the plenary session of the Parliament. I don't know if you would have been aware, but beforehand you could be at a committee meeting, the Dáil would ring a bell for you to go and vote. You'd have to run from the bowels of Leinster House up the stairs, around corridors to make sure that you get to vote. You'd vote for 5 minutes and then you'd return to committee. And so the committee work was very much interrupted, and we really wanted to make sure that that didn't happen again. So now our committees are sitting from 9 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock in the morning. The plenary Parliament starts at 12 o'clock, and we're going to hopefully avoid that. And all bills, including the private members' legislation, now must go through scrutiny before an Oireachtas committee before it actually gets to second stage. And all bills, including Dáil and government bills, have to go through a post-legislative and active period and a review. We've restructured the Oireachtas committees. We've made some of them smaller, with a view to playing probably a far more important role, not least of which in the budgetary process, because there are sectoral issues that will feed into the new Budget Scrutiny Parliament Committee, but also in the individual policy areas. Because it's a much smaller committee, they'll have a much stronger relationship with the Minister and the Department, but also because all of the chairs have been appointed through the Dahan system. The old days of whoever is in government managed and probably persuaded policy in all of those committees is gone now, and the chairs of the committees are all now awarded on the basis of the size of political parties. So we have quite a number of Fianna Fáil chairs, we have Sinn Féin chairs, we have AAA chair, we have independent chairs, and actually, again, I think that's a really, really good thing. And very finally, we've improved the systems of questions in the House. So questions to leaders or from leaders and questions to ministers have been elongated so that we get a better opportunity to actually hold ministers to account in the Parliament, and by allowing all members of Parliament to be able to question leaders and question ministers, as opposed to just previously where it would have been spokespersons. And even though other people would have put their questions in, we would have never got to those questions, so therefore they were probably ineffectual. I think politicians, by virtue of the fact that we are insecure, you don't know how long you'll have a role for or a job for from one election to the other. I think maybe that's one of the reasons why we're so adaptable. And I think TDs, ministers, committee chairs, opposition spokespeople, backbenchers, they've all adapted to the changes over the last couple of weeks. Now, in a lot of ways, it's felt every week that the sand keeps moving, because we introduce the changes not all in one go but in a little bit every week, and we kind of all felt that next week we'll get back to normal and next week will be even calmer than last week. But I think actually this is the new normal. So the new normal now is the fact that from a minority government's perspective we don't think we will win every single vote, but there's also a real anticipation from a private bills perspective that there's a real buzz around the House that somebody in the opposition might just win to pass their legislation. And actually I think it has heightened the atmosphere in Parliament, and it's good. So the Dáil reforms recommended by our report have been introduced. They were introduced over the phase basis. There are teething problems, but as I said to you already, we're going to meet next week and continuously meet to make sure that we refine and make sure that what our intentions are actually borne out in the Dáil. And I believe a minority government is certainly more answerable to the Parliament, but actually I believe every Dáil should be, or every government should be, more answerable to the Parliament. So even if we do see a reversal of what Theresa has spoken about earlier on, and that shift between the sizing voting block between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and Labour isn't reversed, or even if it is reversed and we go back to having large coalitions, I still do think the changes that we've made will have an impact on future policy, on future governments, because they do need to work by consensus and work in a respectful way with each other. I think when you're about to begin a phase in Irish political history when minority order is the order of the day, I think it's genuinely important for all of us to want it to work, not to just say, oh, this is the new buzzword about new politics, or this is the way we should be working, but actually to really genuinely want it to work. One of the most frustrating things I think I would have found in the last number of years is that Governments, be it they Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or Labour or Sinn Féin, they don't have a monopoly on wisdom, and they don't have a monopoly on, making good legislation. Now, yes, OK, there's the tweaking of the Parliamentary Office that do have a wealth of substantial knowledge in drafting, but the idea behind people's policy ideas is something that very much should be embraced, listened to, enhanced and worked upon together. And as I said, I don't think Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin, any one party has a monopoly on what's right for this country. And I think genuinely that's borne out by the barometer of where we're at from our centrist perspective of all parties. We're actually all probably relatively in the centre, looking for a better Ireland and looking to want to have policies that actually makes life for everybody better in this country, not just for a particular few. So I'm going to finish up by just talking about our state at the moment. And I think Owen mentioned it. As a nation, I think we fought very, very hard for our independence. The history books rings off names of those who sought for Irish freedom by constitutional means, the likes of Grattan, O'Connell, Parnell, Redmond, and some of them by more non-constitutional means, Tone, Emmett, Pearse, Collins. I think the reality of anything once it's achieved rarely lives up to the dream. An independent Ireland was never going to be the utopia free of vice. But as a people, we have been too willing to turn, I think, a blind eye to the failings of our state since its foundation. During the campaign for Irish Home Rule, those who opposed it used slogans such as Home Rule, Rome Rule, stoking up fear that such an Ireland would be a country run as a religious state and a country where Protestants, Jews and non-believers would be made unwelcome. I think it's fair to say at this remove that the early decades of the Irish state probably allowed those who made such accusations during the Home Rule debates feel like they had been proven correct. Certainly the last number of years have seen us as a people face up to some of the legacies which we should not be proud of. While we are now in a more open, outward-looking state, as the marriage equality vote last year showed, it's also worth remembering that we are a state where the marriage breakdown of a couple still remains a constitutional issue. And I believe there are other constitutional issues that need to be addressed, and I think that's reflected in the growing numbers in the members of our Parliament who are voicing those kind of thoughts too. In 1964, Declan Costello published his Just Society document. It was a policy paper identifying a number of failings in the Irish state in the early 1960s, and he outlined policy steps to address them. Despite being part of the Fine Gael policy platform in 1965 general election, it was not universally loved by all his fellow TDs, nor did it lead to electoral success. The party, my party, would be out of power for the following 8 years. In fact, the Just Society no doubt seemed a failure to its author and supporters by the late 1960s, but it certainly wasn't. Over 50 years after its publication, when few people can remember what was in Owen's manifesto since February, or even my own manifesto since the general election just months ago, people know exactly what was in the Just Society. It was a game-changing document, not just because of the successes it achieved, but because it caught the imagination of the people, Irish citizens at the time. The generation that followed could be seen as the Just Society generation, one that would start the process of building a new Ireland, a new just Ireland. And some of the things that he wanted to do was that he had economic targets for the private sector, as well as the public sector. He wanted to create policies of commercial banks and bring their credit policies under the control of governments. Maybe if he had, we wouldn't have had the mess that we had to clear up in the last number of years. He wanted direct investment in industry by government. He wanted investment in social capital investment. And he desperately wanted people with disabilities or some sort of special needs to be loved and cherished and provided services by the people of Ireland, by the state bodies in Ireland. He set out in 1964 what I believe is a blueprint for a new Ireland. And since the turn of the millennium, I think we as a people have experienced an almost roller coaster ride. The Celtic Tiger was an economy that was built on sand by a finally huge economic collapse that brought the twin spectre of high unemployment and emigration to the doors and homes of thousands of families in Ireland. And the slow economic pain of the last half a decade to try and bring about the economic recovery, I think, has left a mark on every family in this country. An economic recovery that may be vulnerable to shocks, such as Brexit, but an economic recovery nonetheless. An economic recovery that Fine Gael admittedly oversold in the 2016 election, but an economic recovery nonetheless. I think it's time now for us as a people to decide how we use that recovery to build a just republic. A solid, stable political system, I think, is the foundation stone of any such process and progress. I want a just republic that cherishes each Irish citizen with integrity, a just republic that provides equality of opportunity in every aspect of our life. And I think it's time for new politics to offer that, and in the main to deliver hope for the future generations of Irish people.